Good evening to all of you. Welcome to our ZEW book talk. I'm welcome you to Mannheim, actually, at least virtually. And we have a great book today, Rebellion, Rascals and Revenue. And two great speakers. Let me say, it took me some time to read through that book. It's a thick book, but it was really fun to read. And my feeling was that on every page you could read how much fun you had in writing that book. Many stories, and it's really, I think it's a must read for everyone studying economics, because it tells a lot of stories about public finance, where it's good for, what are the pitfalls, where do you go for. But it's also a good read for someone who's just interested. You know, what about taxation? Why do we need it? And how does it work? And because these are stories throughout the centuries, from Roman empires to Greek to medieval ages until today. The authors are two superstars in the field. Michael Keane, he's Deputy Director of the Fiscal Affairs Department of the International Monetary Fund, and he was before Professor of Economics at the University of Essex. And Joel Slemrod, he is Professor of Business, Economics and Public Policy, both in the Business Department, the Ross School of Business, and in the Department of Economics at the University of Michigan. And so why do I mean they are superstars? They both used to be president of the International Institute of Public Finance, and they both received the very prestigious award of the National Tax Association, the Daniel Holland Medal for distinguished lifetime contributions. So much as an introduction. I'm very happy that you're introducing the book to us, and we will start with your presentation, about 20 minutes of what's in the book, and then we have a chat about some content. So, floor is yours. Great seeing you here, at least on the screen.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks very much for inviting us. I think you can't see me. I'm having trouble with my camera, but as long as you can hear me.
We can hear you and we can read your name. So that's...
And Joel can do the facial expressions to go with the...
Is that right?
I know them by heart now.
So, I think Joel's going to share a screen, which begins with the title page, and we're very proud of the cover. We take no credit for it, but we think it's great. We'll accept any criticism of the book, but not of the cover. So this is, as you see, Taxation Summer Blockbuster. That's a low bar. We don't have many competitors. But really just to, we'll try and give a flavor in the next 15, 20 minutes of what's in the book. And basically what we're trying to do is use a series of bizarre, weird, fascinating, peculiar tax stories over the millennia, both to entertain and also to convey some basic tax principles along the way. So it's there are a lot of kind of fun stories, but it's intended to be more than a collection of fun stories. It occurred to us that we can use these stories to actually convey some basic ideas about taxation in a relatively painless, pleasant way. So our target audience is both people who are interested in tax, find it amusing and enlightening, but also people who might like to learn more about tax, but in a kind of a put off by the usual dryness of tax books. And we hope too that it'll be helpful for people who are teaching tax courses. Sometimes they can get a little bit dry and apparently for some people boring, but we hope this will liven things up. So Joel and I will go through, just give you a flavor of some of the elements of the book. And I should say the book kind of follows the structure of a normal kind of text on taxation. We start with kind of general motivation, then turn to equity issues, excess burden, change behavior, efficiency issues, then to administration, then finish up with some policy lessons and look forward into the future a bit. So in terms of motivating people about taxation, we tell a couple of stories here. We don't think tax explains everything. There are people who think that President Kennedy was assassinated because he was about to remove a tax break for the oil and gas industry. We don't subscribe to that, but it does explain a lot. So here are just a couple of examples. So on the left, this is the only example we know of a war that was really triggered by taxation. And this is the 10 cents war of between 19th century, between, on the one hand, Bolivia and Peru, and on the other hand, Chile. And as you can see, this was a real nasty war. Began 1879 to 1884, I think. So the story there, how did tax trigger this war? Well, there was a region controlled or claimed by Bolivia called Atacama, which was basically desert. No one really cared very much who owned that until they discovered nitrates and guano. It became very valuable real estate. A lot of Chilean companies moved in to extract the resources, and Bolivia imposed an export tax on the extraction of these resources. But they also added what we would now call a fiscal stability clause. That is, they said they would not change the tax for 10, 15 years, whatever it was. But they did change the tax. They increased it. And that was followed by invasion by Chile. Peru was brought into the war because they had a secret treaty with Bolivia. And the war ended very badly for Bolivia and Peru, who lost the province of Atacama, became a very valuable part of Chile. And that meant also that Bolivia became landlocked, didn't have access to the sea. So taxation may not change everything, but at least it changes the maps of the world sometimes. And just to say, this is a continuing issue in the region. Even only a couple of years ago, the case came before the International Court of Justice, and Bolivia is still very unhappy about this. And we are told that in the annual Miss Bolivia contest, there is still a contestant from the missing province of Atacama. The story on the right, actually, this is an example of a story that has no really great tax lesson at all that we can think of, but it's just interesting. So what is going on here? This is the story of Madame Cayo. Now, Madame Cayo was the wife of Joseph Cayo, who was Minister of Finance in France just before the First World War. And he was known for two things at the time, Monsieur Cayo. One was he was an advocate of closer relations with Germany. And the second was he was a strong advocate of the income tax. And many of you will know of the Projet Cayo, which is the French form of the income tax. So what was the story here? Well, these two features made Monsieur Cayo pretty unpopular with a number of people in France, including the readers and editors of Le Monde. And essentially, they were trying to not make life easy for Monsieur Cayo. And they got hold of some letters that Monsieur Cayo had written to his wife, very passionate, loving letters. What was the problem with that? Well, the problem was that he wasn't actually married to this wife at the time. He was married to an earlier wife. So potentially huge scandal. Madame Cayo realizes that the paper is going to publish these letters. And so she calmly gets in her car, is driven off to the offices. It was Le Figaro, waits for the editor returns, and she shoots him dead. And this becomes a great cause célèbre in France. And if you look at the newspapers in France in July 1914, it's really only essentially Austria's ultimatum to Serbia that knocks Madame Cayo off the front page. So tax people have interesting lives. No great tax story in that, but it's just something that we hope to keep readers interested as we unfold the story. We then turn to a little bit, I should say, by the way, that you might have thought, well, isn't the other war that was triggered by taxation surely the American Revolution? Well, actually, the story we tell in the book was that the myth is that American Revolution was prompted by a tax increase by the British. In fact, the truth, as we explain in the book, is that it was prompted by a tax cut. It was a tax cut that led to the Boston Tea Party, but we won't go into that now. We'll move on to say a little bit about equity, which is obviously a big focus of the book, is how governments over the ages have tried to pursue fairness in taxation. Even if they don't care about fairness, they care about the risk of revolt and rebellion. Many ways they've tried to do this over the past. In the past, some of them we may have a chance to talk about. They've sometimes taxed by social class, as in England, France, and in Prussia, I believe. They've taxed by proxies of well-being, and we'll come on to some of that. They've taxed by region, left it to local elites to figure out what's fair. So all kinds of ways that fairness has been pursued, but sometimes things go badly wrong. And the example on the story on the left, this is a gentleman called Baibura, who is a national hero in Sierra Leone because he led a revolt against the British in 1898. The British decided to impose a tax on huts, which caused grave offense, not only because of the level of the tax, but also because it interfered with local notions of ownership and rights and communal property and the rights of local chiefs. this is a kind of paradigmatic example of a colonial tax revolt. Became very unpleasant indeed. Eventually, the British put down the rebellion, but Baibora lives on as a national hero in Sierra Leone. He has his face on one of the banknotes, and he even has a football team named after him. So governments pursue fairness. Sometimes, as we know, it goes very badly wrong. And we can say a little bit about why, when it goes wrong. Generally, the story we find is that it's not only the tax itself that prompts revolts. There's usually something else going on as well. We see that in recent examples around the world. But in Sierra Leone, for example, the problem with the hut tax was not only the level of the tax, but that, as I say, particularly interfered with the established rights and practices of the local kings and chiefs. But at this point, I hand over to Joel for one of his favorite stories from the book.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Mick. Hi to everybody. Thanks for this invitation to talk about our book, which, as Achim noticed, was a labor of love, a long one, but nevertheless a labor of love. So before the income tax, which has only been around for a couple hundred years, before the income tax, countries wanted to have some level of fairness in the assignment of tax burden, but they used other methods to do so. One sees a lot of excise taxes on luxury goods. One sees apparently bizarre, but actually not so bizarre, taxes on things like windows. Windows being correlated with how grand one's house is, and how grand one's house is highly correlated with how well off one is. The picture on the right, the painting on the right, is a painting of a walking bridge in the Caribbean island of Curacao. And we talk about an episode related to this bridge known as the Queen Emma Bridge, because it is an example of an attempt at levying a progressive tax burden that was undermined by people's behavioral response. Here's the story. When it was built in 1888, actually by the American ambassador, to fund it, there was a toll to cross this walking bridge. And to make it progressive in the era when it wasn't really reasonable to ask people to bring their income tax forms, this is 1888, they said, well, there's a toll for people who cross the bridge wearing shoes or boots, presumably the more wealthy among the population. But it was free to cross the bridge if people were barefoot, presumably the poorer among the Curaçaoans. Well, the behavioral response that undermined this attempt at progressivity was that many poor Curaçaoans were so prideful that they would borrow shoes or boots to cross the bridge to not have to admit that they were poor at the cost of paying the toll. On the other hand, many of the rich Curaçaoans were not so prideful and were avaricious, and so they would dump their shoes and boots before they crossed, enabling them to cross for free. We have other examples in the book of how behavioral response can undermine progressivity. And of course, at least in the US, that kind of thing is on the front page of the newspapers regularly. Okay. Okay, so many of you in the audience teach public finance, and you all know that a central concept in modern public finance is the idea of excess burden. The idea that the burden that a tax imposes on society has one part, which is the transfer of resources. The taxes are remitted by the citizens. But another part is the fact that most all taxes change behavior. They induce people and businesses to make decisions to do things they wouldn't otherwise do. They, in general, will work less than otherwise. Businesses will, in general, invest less than otherwise. And the way we explain it in public finance classes also often features this diagram on the left, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And this excess burden of taxation is indicated by the area of the triangles D plus E, the famous Harburger triangle. And I think we can admit it's not the most vivid way to explain excess burden. And it's also not the easiest thing to empirically measure because it involves finding out what, for example, labor supply would have been if it weren't for taxes, what investment would have been if it weren't for taxes. We have econometric methods to get at that, but often not so compelling. In our book, we have a lot of pictures, probably more pictures and images than any book on taxation ever. And the image on the right is an illustration, a visible illustration of excess burden. And this comes back to the window tax in England. There was a tax on buildings based on the number of windows it had. And what was the behavioral response it engendered? Well, some of it can still be seen today. It's as a picture of a building where clearly there were windows at one time, but they were bricked up, presumably because of the window tax. And we have lots of pictures, often of buildings that look different than you might expect them to look because of the way they were taxed. We have pictures of very skinny, deep, and tall buildings, which are probably that way because the property tax was based on the frontage of the building. We even have a picture of a dog without a tail, which the internet tells you was a response to a tax on dogs, also in England, that exempted dogs without tails. I say apparently because that one seems to be a great story from the internet, but one that is not true. Evasion and avoidance. Evasion goes back as far as taxes itself. We know that from cuneiform documents from ancient Sumer and papyri from 3,000 years ago, detailing a father who tried to pass along his inheritance to his son and undervalued it to lower the inheritance tax. Evasion is not so easy to show with vivid images. Obviously, if you're evading taxes, you don't want it to be easily discovered, and you certainly don't want to make a fuss over it. But avoidance, which are legal ways to reduce taxes, you can find lots of great images that illustrate avoidance. The top one is a ship, a Dutch ship known as a Floit. How can we see the tax of ships in this picture? Well, in Holland at the time, the tax on ships was based on the square footage of the deck. And you can see in this picture that this ship has a fairly small deck relative to the cargo hold beneath the deck. And this was a way to minimize taxation relative to the value of the cargo the ship held. It turns out that this also was a good way to build ships. It made them seaworthy. Mick knows the story of how the tax system in Britain did not have that aspect, that in order to minimize taxes, it induced Brits to make ships that were not particularly seaworthy. And the bottom right is a picture of two brothers, the Vesti brothers. The Vesti brothers had a global meat production distribution business. And they became quite famous for arranging their business to minimize the worldwide taxes. I think one of them relocated to Argentina. They inverted some of their businesses. They did a lot of the things you can read about on the front pages of papers today that multinational companies do to minimize their tax burden. An inland revenue agent said trying to collect taxes from the Vesties was like trying to squeeze a rice pudding. And when the Queen, a couple decades ago, was made subject to income tax, one of the descendants of the Vesties said, well, that leaves just us. I think, Mick, you should take this one.
Well, that's not. It really follows on very much from the Vesti brothers. We talk in the book. I'm not going to go through this. We talk in the book about schemes of international tax avoidance, both for kind of corporate level and individual level. And as Joel says, we like to have pictures. And so on the left of this, you see this is a representation of the famous, infamous double Irish Dutch sandwich form of tax avoidance. Don't worry, we don't go through that in the book. But we were struck by the resemblance to the picture on the right, which is a cartoon by a famous British cartoonist, Heath Robinson, who used to like to draw pictures of weird and wonderful machines for doing bizarre things. And this was his machine for doubling Gloucester cheese by the Gruyere method. So the one on the right is kind of complete nonsense. And the one on the left is probably also complete nonsense. So these are sort of nonsense pictures to illustrate our take on the current international tax system. And we do talk, by the way, about Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 and so on, but let's not go into that now.
Okay, last slide before we go to questions and conversation. We talk a bit about the art of tax administration. Governments can't just announce and often publish their tax code and wait for the money to roll in. They need a tax administration. They need a tax enforcement. So here are a few illustrations of the stories we tell. On the left is something called a zhi from ancient China. The zhi was a method to verify that ships on a particular river qualified for a tax exemption. And it consisted of two beautiful pieces of what looked like art that are now in the tax museum in Beijing. They were identical. You can only see the bottom of two, but the ship would have one, and the customs administrator at the river ports would have another. And so when the ship came through, it had to provide their half, and it had to match the half that the customs administration had in order for the exemption to be granted. The picture in the middle is the guillotine in Paris, and it illustrates our story that although now these days tax administration is almost always part of the government bureaucracy, it wasn't always that way for centuries in Europe and outside of Europe. Governments sold the right to collect taxes to private entities. This was called tax farming. That way the government got a fixed amount of revenue, and it was up to the private company to collect the taxes. And the more they collected, the more they got to keep. Well, you can guess tax farmers were not the most popular folks in any given country. And come the French Revolution, they were particularly abhorred. We know a lot about tax farming in part because the famous chemist Antoine Lavoisier was a tax farmer, and he kept meticulous records of his tax farming business. And in 1793, when the revolutionaries decided to put the tax farmers on trial, it was Lavoisier who drew up their defense. How did it go? Well, you can probably guess from our including this picture that it didn't go well. It turns out in retrospect, the French tax farmers hadn't been ripping off the government. In fact, they were owed money by the government. Finally, on the right is a statue of a man named Robert Hart. There are many statues of the world. Only one is in our book. Robert Hart was a tax administrator. He is, we think, the only tax administrator ever honored anywhere with a statue. This is a statue of him in Shanghai. It's not there anymore, but it stood for many years. Robert Hart was from Northern Ireland, and he came over to China to help administer the Chinese tax system. He stayed for decades, ended up improving the Chinese bureaucracy, not only in tax collection, but in many areas, and was given a very high award by the Chinese emperor. His love life was interesting enough that there's actually a novel about Robert Hart that talks little or not at all about tax collection, but instead about his love life. Mick has tried to read it and tells me it is not very good. But we talk about Robert Hart to make the point that tax administrators are often the unsung heroes of governments because they help collect revenue needed for the things that civilizations need in a way that is as fair and equitable as possible. Okay, that's what we've got. Just to introduce you to what our book is about. Mick, do you have any final words before we move to questions?
No, that was masterful. No, and you're quite right on that book. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Yeah,
I can see you now, Mick.
That's right. We can see each other, so that's good.
Yeah, there's some switch I missed. Yeah.
So it's you can hear me also, yeah. So I'm
Yes.
Brilliant. So everything is set up. Yeah, it's a lot of fun to read the book. Actually, we have in Mannheim here a strong group on taxation, Mannheim Taxation. They are co-sponsoring this event, and we are more than 100 economists work on them. And so far, I believe, you know, it sometimes can be technically and hard, but it's a lot of fun. It looks like, yeah. So it's great that you have this topic. I actually learned also a lot by reading your book. And one story I wanted to tell for the German audience. There are many myths in that book, myths which don't hold. Yeah, so Mythen is a German word. And one thing I learned is that in Germany we say, you know, once a tax is there, it never disappears. Yeah, and there's a famous tax from 1900 to finance the fleet of the government, and that was a tax on sparkling wine. And it still exists today. And so the story in Germany is, you know, once they introduce a tax, it won't go away. And we have a recent for the last 30 years, a solidarity surcharge to finance unification. And that was abolished, but only for the lower incomes. Yeah, so still half of the tax, I think it generates 20 billion. It used to, now it generates 10 billion. It's still there. However, in your books, there are many taxes which were introduced before wars, and then they were taken away. Yeah, so it's a myth, I suppose, that taxes can't disappear. Taxes also can go away. Is that right?
Yeah, you're right. We actually talk about a lot of taxes that lasted a century or more and aren't around anymore. The window tax is an example. We talk about many countries and US states having taxes on bachelors. They're almost all gone now. Mick is quite interested in excess profits taxes, which tend to be introduced during wars and maybe not entirely for good purposes, tend to disappear after the wars are over.
Yeah. Okay. And yeah, no, that's right. And I think too, one of the interesting things that certainly I appreciated more writing the book was on the was how the disappearance is linked with the common theme of trying to find ways to tax more fairly or to attune liability to ability to pay. So in a sense, looking at the past, you know, you have taxes, as I was saying, by looking at somebody's, the land they control, or looking, you know, taxes on fireplaces came before the tax on windows, taxes on social class, taxes on luxury items, which kind of in a way lead up to the income tax that we have now. But there's a question, well, okay, the income tax, when you see it in the light of being the, you know, the culmination so far of this trend over millennia, well, it makes you think, well, you know, the income tax is not necessarily a rule of nature. What is going to, you know, where's the income tax going to go? What is the next successor to that going to be? Mm-hmm. So there's kind of method to in how things come and go, I think.
Okay, so maybe our taxes, this solidarity surcharge is so, it's such a good tax that it will stay. Yeah. So and at least there are no windows involved. One thing made me nervous. Actually, I'm a microeconomist. I care who pays. Yeah. So a tax who pays. Yeah. And on page 378, it's nearly, at the end of the book, you say economists thus know embarrassingly little about the real incidence of many taxes. And actually, you would assume that's a big issue. What is the incidence? And that has, in Germany, we have many debates. For example, we currently have a debate for CO2 prices on heating. Who pays? Is it the landlord or is it the person renting the apartment? Yeah. But what we would care about is the incidence. Who pays in the end, and not who pays formally. Yeah. And we have. You had one example in your book. Under Trump, the reduction in the tax. Yeah. And it's not clear who profits from this reduction. Is it the companies? Is it the worker? Yeah. And so what? Put it as a question. Concerning the incidents, what is the lessons learned, and why is this, in the public debate, we typically don't talk about incidents. We talk about taxes and who pays, but we don't talk about incidents. Why is that the case? I think it's a big puzzle. I don't know, why we don't talk more about incidents when we talk about taxes in the public debate.
Yeah. Well, let me start on that. No, I think I'm very, very happy you raised that issue, because I think that's one we sort of feel strongly about. And I think one of the reasons that we wrote the book was a sense that people like Joel and me, or our profession widely, haven't done a great job at conveying these basic ideas about taxation, issues of excess burden we did talk about in the presentation, but also issues of incidence, which at some points in history have become real focus of public discussions. An example from my country goes back to the medieval time, when we had an export tax on wool that was paid by the Italian merchants who were shipping the wool out. But basically the incidence was not on the merchants, it was on the wool growers. So it became a big sort of political issue that the wool growers wanted the political influence with the king in setting the tax, rather than have the king negotiate with the merchants. And that became part of the growth of Parliament, was to deal with that incidence issue. And there are big incidence issues in my country again in the 19th century. But I think you're right that we don't focus that much on incidence. Now, I think it's partly because, as I say, we haven't done a great job in conveying ideas, but I think it's also because powerful interests have an incentive to conceal incidence issues, particularly by the way they choose to name taxes. And that's something, maybe I'll hand over to Joel on that, because I know that's something he feels strongly about. But one of the lessons of the book is, we try to convey basic ideas of how to think about incidence, but at the end of the day, the main lesson is to recognize that there is an incidence question, and that people may be deliberately misleading you about the incidence. But Joel, you always wax very lyrical on this one. So.
Well, I think incidence is another one of those issues that those of us who teach tax could use a little bit of livening up. So we have several examples in the book about where incidence is important and is not clear. We talk about a tax on female servants in England, where the intent was, I think, to have a progressive tax, thinking it is the masters, not the servants, who would bear the burden of the tax. But it turns out that was not entirely true. We talk about the financial activities tax that many have proposed, and some call the Robin Hood tax. The name of calling it a Robin Hood tax suggests that this is a very progressive tax, but that is just not clear that it would be the bigwigs at financial institutions who would bear the burden. It could very well be largely people who have their money in pension funds or et cetera. And so the burden would not be so progressive. That's an example of an important question where we don't really know the answer. And as Achim mentioned, who bears the burden of the corporate tax is absolutely critically important. And we don't know for sure And yes, when the Trump administration reduced the corporation income tax, some of the economists in the administration said they were quite sure that the benefit of that tax reduction would be borne by workers, that workers would be better off because the corporate tax was reduced. Maybe a little bit, but I think we're far from sure from saying that it would most or even all, certainly all of the benefit of a corporate tax reduction would go to workers.
What I wondered is whether it makes sense to have a kind of an institutional response like the Dutch have. So when they have party programs, there's an independent institution which calculates what it means, to have a reduction in taxes. Germany, we have currently, our election is coming up in September, and we have currently a debate about the tax programs of the party, and actually also our group did some calculations on that one, but they did kind of a calculation, who profits in the first stage, if there's a tax reduction, someone profits in the first stage, but it's not, what happens afterwards, what's the incidence afterwards, how does labor market respond to it, how does investment respond to it, to tax reduction or tax increases. And so I wondered whether, because it's so important, tax issues for society, whether we need an independent board, doing the calculation on the incidence of taxes, like the Dutch have. Do you have thoughts about that?
I can't speak for Germany or the Netherlands, but I'm pretty sure that if we had an independent institution in the US, that would not end all controversy and would not end all debate.
Yeah, and I guess in the UK, where I'm from, we have the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which kind of does a similar task. But even as Joel's point, I think even some of those studies, if you look at the impact of a change in the VAT, the standard assumption is usually to assume changes are fully passed on, and that's not obviously true. I mean, it's I think the controversies are going to be there. They are just things that we're certainly not close to knowing the true answers to a bunch of these questions, but I think the key point is to at least have people recognize that there are issues here, and that people may be pulling the wool over their eyes. You should tell the estate tax one, Joel. That's
okay, Sorry, you teed me up for that one, Mick, and then I didn't tell the story. So we in an early chapter we talk about naming issues, and that supporters of taxes and opponents of taxes try to name the tax or refer to the tax in a way that supports their cause. And my favorite one is a few decades ago, the Republicans in Congress who opposed the estate and gift tax agreed among themselves to, from there on, always call it the death tax. That, of course, makes the tax sound even worse than it is, even though death is neither sufficient nor necessary for a death tax liability. It's not sufficient because there's a very high exemption. So most people, when they pass away, there is no death tax liability. And it's not necessary either because it's estate and gift tax. So you can be liable to the tax if you make enough gifts during your lifetime, even before you die. Anyway, the name sort of stuck, and I have to believe it didn't help the political prospects of the estate and gift tax when people started talking about it as the death tax.
Very nice examples in your book on different names for taxes. So you already mentioned the death tax, you had the Robin Hood tax on financial transaction. One I liked was the love tax. So if a single parent moves to a partner and there was a reduction benefit, and that was called the love tax. But somehow it's worrying that our public debate about taxes is more about wording than it's about incidence. And then somehow I think we need, we definitely need to do more research, and we need to work more, and also to explain more where these taxes accrue. One thing with taxes, we need them to finance public expenditure, fair enough. The other thing is to steer behavior. So you have one chapter on tax bads, so like smoking or drugs and not goods. And the famous example for steering behavior, or where we all want to steer it, is CO2 prices, or a tax on CO2. So it's a tax on emissions, and you know, if it's more costly to emit, then surely people emit less. That's the idea behind it. And in your book you say, and I would agree, is there's a remarkable consensus among economists that CO2 prices are the thing we should have. Yeah, but the United States, you had a debate on it, and you decided, the parliament, I think, decided against CO2 prices. And in Switzerland, they had a public vote on it, and the public decided against CO2 prices. Yeah, so how can it be that we all agree, we all economists, yeah, and the public disagrees? Yeah, so it's a puzzle. What's your opinion on that one, on CO2 prices?
Well, your observation about the US is absolutely correct. And it's especially interesting to note that the Biden administration, in their proposals, they have a lot about climate change. But one thing they don't have is a tax on carbon. Why is that? Well, the US is noticeably tax phobic. We could look for historical explanations for that. But I think politicians here have learned that the less taxes, especially the less new taxes one proposes, the better are one's political prospects. The value-added tax being another notable absence in the US tax arsenal, and it's probably due to the same phobia.
Yeah, I'm afraid I've nothing to add. I think I find it puzzling and depressing too. I guess maybe we need to convey better to people that, you know, if you don't bear the cost in the form of the carbon price, you're going to bear an even larger cost in some other form that maybe not so tangible and direct. So maybe it's not as salient. You know, maybe the other costs, if we achieve the same mitigation targets by regulatory methods, we know they're generally going to be more costly, but maybe the cost is less salient to people than perhaps a carbon price would be. So again, it comes back to Akim, your point about communicating these things, which we have a lot of work to do.
Maybe we need a better name for it. Save the world fee,
oh, there you
or
go.
something like that. Yeah. So, but actually, it's a serious problem. I spoke to this, our Ministry for Economic Affairs, and they are discussing with, you know, Europe is discussing with the United States to form a climate club. Yeah, so like Nordhaus proposed that we, you know, but one big issue is, you know, a club, you know, on what does it agree upon? And because we have CO2 prices in Europe, but it's not in the United States. Yeah, so, you know, what's inside the club? And that's a big issue. Yeah? So it's, no, that's a problem. I thought that's interesting. I thought about, you know, taxing bad to steer behavior is a tax on tobacco. Yeah, on smoking, a tax on smoking. But in your book, you explain it's not an externality tax. Yeah, so typically in economics, we have this feature that if you do something which is bad for the environment or which is bad for, you know, people living around you, like smoking, or then you do a tax on it. Yeah, or but here it's not, or bad for yourself, you even do a tax on it. But here it's not the externality argument. Yeah, so the tax has a different reason. It's a tax on smoking.
I think, Mick,
I'm
you're more passionate about this. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say I'm a smoker, so maybe I should leave that one to you. Well, I think actually, I'll come back to that maybe, but no, I think the argument is that, yeah, there are external costs to smoking that you mentioned. But the argument would be that those are more than amply covered by the levels of taxation we see in many countries already, even leaving aside the fact that smokers, you know, we die early and so on, we're actually cheaper in that sense. But I think the argument is that there are externalities, but they're more or less covered by the levels we see in most advanced countries now. So if you were to try to rationalize these cigarette tax at the levels we observe now, it would be, you go with this, what they call an internality argument, that it's really about self-control, that people would like to be able to commit to, no, I'd like to be able to say, well, I'm going to have a cigarette now, but that's going to be the last one I'll ever have. But that's kind of, there's a credibility commitment issue there. And so the argument is that taxation can help people overcome this internality self-control problem. And it's a similar argument, I think, when you think about taxes related to obesity and other things, where, you know, the externalities aren't that huge, but maybe the internal costs are. But That reminds me, once I spoke at a conference on cigarette taxes, and I said, said, well, I'm a smoker, and the chair said, well, thank you for declaring an interest. And I thought, well, it's actually all the non-smokers who should declare their interest in this, right? It's they're the interest group ganging up to tax some other body, and we're supposed to declare our interest. Anyway, you see, I have some, as Joel says, I have some passionate feelings about that.
Yeah,
But I think in general, the internality argument is the more, to me, I think to us, is the more compelling one for the levels we observe at the moment. And as I say, in other areas where people talk about corrective taxes now, obesity, sugary drinks and things like that, they're primarily, I would say, internality arguments, not externality ones.
Mick, I haven't heard that story, even though we've been working on this book for, 7 years? But I never heard that one before. You're just keeping some surprises for me to keep me interested.
It's for the next edition
I'm still,
of the book.
Brewing over that one. I'm still quietly fuming over that problem. Yeah.
That's right. Actually, why I like the story is that I think also the other stories about the names for taxes which matter so much in Incidence, people don't understand or they don't debate it, is that I think we need much more behavioral economics in public finance. I know it's starting and there are people working on it, but there's so strong links to behavioral economics. It's not just rational taxation. It's it's behavioral in the end, and so we must understand that much better, I think. There's one topic I want to ask you actually, which is not so much in your book, but it's, I'm coming from competition policy, and we have our welfare analysis, but lawyers, they think completely different competition policies. They, for example, they protect competition by itself, which we don't have in our models. And now coming to taxes, to your field, in Germany, the lawyers really determine our tax system to a strong degree. And in our research group here, Mannheim Taxation, which is ZDW and the university, we also have many lawyers being involved on taxation. And one issue is they say taxes are paid according to Leistungsfähigkeit, which is the ability to perform. Yeah, so who can perform better pays more taxes. Yeah, and the subject of this Leistungsfähigkeit, the ability to perform, is not the person, but it's the household. A household can perform better or worse. Yeah. And out of that principle, many results, come out in the end. For example, that we have income splitting inside a household because it's the household. Yeah, and if you propose a tax which is flat across, you have a chapter on the poll tax, on the poll. I guess it would. I'm not a lawyer, but I guess the lawyers would have problems with the poll tax because it's not according to Leistungsfähigkeit. It's not according to ability to perform. Actually, just as an interesting side remark, in 1995, the lawyers established a principle of half division. So our highest court established. So the government was not allowed to tax more than 50% of your wealth because they had good arguments for it. However, in 2006. The federal court, constitutional court, abandoned that principle. So we had a principle, but it's gone. Yeah, I actually liked that one, but I understand that it's gone. Yeah, so because there was not good a basis. But steering the tax system with principles could be also, it could make sense because there's so many issues involved. We just mentioned incidents, behavioral responses. How does market respond? So maybe we should look more for principles rather than having our welfare analysis. Yeah, so you have an opinion on that one?
Well, I have for many years regularly gone to the seminar on taxation in our law school, and I've learned a lot. Some economists, you probably know, would doubt that could happen, but I'm not one of those. Let me just say a couple of the things that I've learned, and the second one will come back to what you just said. First one I learned was how important to tax systems are what Mick and I call line drawing. For example, you have a sales tax on some goods and not on others. Well, the law has to draw a line between what is taxed and what is not taxed. Probably the most important example of this is the difference between debt and equity. Debt finance is tax favored, and how do you tell what's debt and what's equity for complicated securities? And it matters because there's an interest to make your when you raise money for your corporation to make it look for tax purposes like debt, but to be as much like equity as possible. So I learned a lot about the importance of line drawing. Back to your point, though, if lawyers are better at things like thinking about things like fairness and ethics, we can use their input, because fairness is not at its bottom an economics issue. Economists, I think, should lay out the menu of policies, some of which are more efficient but less fair, but we need values to make those decisions. And the values usually are imparted to tax policy through the political system, through elections. But I think we can also learn by thinking about first principles of fairness. And I don't think I would look to economists first. I'd look to philosophers, I'd look to ethicists, and I'd look to lawyers.
Mm-hmm. Just from my perspective, I work closely with lawyers at the fund on our tax work and enjoy it, learn a lot. I do think we need to, somehow we don't quite get the dialogue between the two groups working as well as it should. And I think, as I'm sure lawyers would complain about economists, but as an economist, you do come across legal issues that are so frustrating. They basically don't make any sense to an economist. The example that comes to mind was the debate about the destination-based cash flow in the US. And the destination-based cash flow is a combination of, for an economist, it's a VAT and a labor subsidy. Fine, that's what it is. And you go along to the WTO rules and you find somehow this is WTO inconsistent, even though each of those individually would be fine. There may be ways around it. There are papers on ways around it, but we do as economists, you come across, and including in constitutions, we give a few examples of things that have gone into constitutions that really don't make much economic sense. You give you allocate the power to tax goods to one level of government, the power to tax services to another. That certainly doesn't make sense if you want to have some kind of VAT. So yeah, I think lawyers are great. I think, again, maybe both our professions haven't done as good a job as maybe respecting each other and drawing on each other's insights and getting together at appropriate times. And I think we can see some. It's probably your remark about lawyers being dominant is, I would say, true about, for example, recent developments on international tax, and which I think that's. The lawyer's hand is more visible, I'd say, than the economist's hand in much of that discussion.
Yeah, one thing is that we take the law system kind of as a constraint, and then we optimize inside that system. So that would be the economist approach. Yeah. But in some areas, I think that working on the basis of principles, it also can help steer us, because our knowledge, we have limits to our knowledge, as you say. Our empirics is not as well developed, and it's a social science. In the end, there's so many effects. But one thing I want to discuss with you, and we still have 10 more minutes, and you already alluded to it, is international taxation. So that's what's happening at the moment. Yeah, OECD is trying to have new tax system around the world. Is it right to call that a revolution? Would that be the biggest step to the tax system in the last 50 years, or you think in the end it will have minor effects? Actually, we have studies on that one. I can tell you a little bit more about our studies here. But first, your opinion. So what do you think about it? And is it a big step forward? Or is it a big step? It could be backward. Yeah, what's your opinion? Right.
Well, let me take a first crack at that. I think it is pretty radical. I think conceptually, they're really big breakthroughs. We're now talking about an element of, though people still avoid the word, an element of destination-based taxation. Some method of taxing multinationals other than by applying arm's length pricing. And those are both things that, 5 years ago, I remember, having to explain to people what those were and sort of being looked at as if I was from outer space in terms of how it was kind of a taboo in many circles to even criticize arm's length pricing or to think about reallocating taxing rights. And then the whole minimum tax as well is of course a great novelty. So I do think that they are welcome and radical innovations conceptually. in terms of moving away from the framework we've had for a century or more. Whether it's the end of the road is another question. Whether there's going to be more to come, I think, is another question. And certainly we haven't. I don't think anybody would claim that we've simplified things. So that would be my take. So it's because I'm at a point now where I'm now retiring from the IMF, and I would never have dreamt 20 years ago that I would be leaving at a time when arm's length pricing was being challenged, minimum taxes were being seriously discussed, formulary methods, destination based. I'd never dreamt that would happen in my time. So I'm in that sense positive, but as I say, there may be more to come, but that would be my take.
On the minimum tax, I agree with Mick that this is conceptually a breakthrough, but I'm less optimistic about the practical implementation of it, as it's pretty clear that what you want to do is put a constraint on how low effective tax rates can be in a country. Just putting a minimum statutory rate in place isn't going to do it. There has to be a lot more about the other aspects of the tax system. And I'm just not sure that countries are going to be willing to give up their sovereignty for that. And it's one of the lessons we end in the book on, that tax sovereignty is a thing of the past. That might be too strong. Tax sovereignty might, though, become the big issue in implementing things like a minimum tax.
Actually, that's a little bit kind of the opinion which our group here has, that one is the minimum tax in Europe won't change so much, because some countries have lower taxes, but the effective tax rate is not so much lower. And the other thing is that with the destination-based tax, it's a new thing, yeah, and it's not clear how it works, and so there are some suggestions actually to use the VAT system, rather improve on the system, yeah, rather than have a new tax on it, yeah. But it's a big development, and it's exciting times for tax analysts, I would say.
Yeah. I'll just come back. I'm not, I think my point is that really the genie, the expression, the genie is out of the bottle.
Yeah.
That now the international community has said, okay, destination-based taxation, okay, we can live with some of that. Moving away to formulary methods, we can live with some of that. Moving towards a minimum tax, I know all the detail of carve-outs and so on is hugely important, but nonetheless, I think once those ideas are out, then they're not going back in the bottle. And, I think that to me is the important part of what's happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's again, it's more behavioral. What does it mean for the political system once it's on the table, and what will happen the next 10 years, and not just with that thing. Yeah. There's so many more things to discuss. Unfortunately, our time is running out. It's over. I hope to the viewers you got some understanding, some feeling for what's inside the book. So if you don't have your summer lecture yet for the holidays, so I recommend this one. It's really it's fun to read, and it's good stuff. I want to use, my last minute to thank our supporters, the ZDW Förderkreis, who made this possible, and Mannheim Taxation, our researchers, and also make advertisement for our next ZDW book talk, which will be in 14th of September, which will be Philippe Aguillon. And he talks about his new book, The Power of Creative Destruction, Economic Upheaval and the Wealth of Nations. So that will come 14th of September. So thank you for joining. It was a lot of fun talking to you. It's so much more which is in the tax system. So I hope that people got some inspiration from our talk today, and also from the book you get many inspiration. Thanks for joining, and have a nice day to you. For our viewers, have a nice evening. Goodbye.
Thanks for having us.
It's all right, Keith. Thank you. Bye-bye.